Hello and welcome to the Political Opinions Podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. Today's episode will cover different opinions on Scottish independence. In 2014, Scotland voted by 2 million to 1.6 million to remain part of the United Kingdom. It was hoped that this result would quell continued calls for Scottish independence. This hasn't been the case, however, and since the Brexit result, in which the UK as a whole voted to leave, but Scotland overwhelmingly voted to remain, calls for a second independence referendum have only increased. It is now estimated that if an independence referendum were to occur, Scotland would vote in favour to leave. The issue of Scottish independence is very divisive, with many arguments on both sides, and in this episode we will unpick and compare these opinions. Quick note that this episode is only focusing on the general arguments for independence, not whether, for example, Scotland has the right to call an independence referendum without the approval of Westminster. As always, the aim of this episode is not to try and argue for or against one side of the debate, but rather to highlight the different opinions on the topic and provide a comparison between them. With all that being said, I will begin with the arguments in favour of independence, followed by those opposed, with a comparison at the end. Regarding calls for Scottish independence, first we have those revolving around identity. Scotland has been an independent nation for far longer in its history than it has been part of any union. The so-called Braveheart generation in Scotland support this belief in the history of a free Scotland, and to some they just feel inherently different to the English. They do not identify as British, they identify as Scottish, and as such those calls for independence stem from the fact that they feel they would do better with identity-wise being alone than part of a union. On the question of the economy, well, those in favour argue that Scotland often plays second fiddle to English concerns for trade and economic decisions. To some, Westminster is inherently biased towards the English economy and doesn't consider the need of the Scottish one, and as such, by being independent, Scotland would be better able to focus its economic capacity on its own economy, not be part of a wider British one. Some people also argue that as Scotland has access to many natural resources, it can operate effectively as an independent nation. Often, the most important factor in this is North Sea oil, but they also have readily accessible sources of renewable energy, such as tidal energy and wave energy, and also wind energy, being surrounded by the North Sea, of course. And therefore, some argue Scotland has the capability to survive alone and will be able to fully exploit its resources for its economy. For political reasons, some people say that although there is devolution, Scotland doesn't have much of a say in matters concerning the entire United Kingdom. Just as Scotland overwhelmingly voted to remain in the EU, yet was trumped by English votes to leave, so too do some feel that Scotland lacks true self-determination due to the far greater number of English MPs, and due to the fact that almost always the government is formed exclusively, or almost exclusively, of English MPs. And this stems from the whole idea that Scotland should have self-determination, and should not be held back by a union with other countries in which it is not the primary player. On a more niche argument, some people also argue that Scotland is more left-wing than England in terms of proportion of the population, and as such they need to be free from the control of the Tories or Conservative Party. A lot of people in Scotland feel averse to the Conservatives, with a common theme being that there are more exotic animals than MPs in relation to Scotland. In fact, at most you have under 5 to 10 Conservative MPs on a good election basis, and as such to some, by essentially breaking away from the union, they would be totally free of the Conservative control, given that they are the most prominent party in government in Westminster. Some people also argue that although the UK provides access to global leadership through membership of the G20, the G8, for the UN Security Council, Scotland is still a minority partner to England. And so to some, being free to act as an independent nation means that Scotland can align its global position to what it actually wants. For example, being able to rejoin the EU would be more beneficial to Scotland's global position to some than staying in the United Kingdom. On the issue of devolution, those wanting independence believe that it doesn't solve Scotland's problems. Although Scotland has some autonomy from Westminster, they believe that nothing more will come of this due to the fact that, for example, they won't get a federal system unless they gain independence, and believe that devolution is only done to quell Scottish calls for independence, when in fact the best course for Scotland would be to be totally independent. Finally, Some people argue that the English and the Scottish are just different. They are different politically, with Scotland being more left-wing than England. They are different culturally, and they have a different history. Although some argue that there is a shared history, some people argue that the English and the Scottish are different. This stems into this identity idea. But essentially to some, being in a union with a country whose people are different to your own is not beneficial, and as such they support an independence movement. Regarding arguments and calls to remain in the Union, a key area for contention for many people opposed to independence is that of identity again. To some, their prevailing identity is British, not Scottish. Scotland and England speak the same language, they share the same history, and they possess a common identity that to some is more important than what they view as a mythical Scottish identity that stems from a time before the Union. Furthermore, currently, the Scottish and English are extremely intertwined with one another, with people of different nationalities living across the borders and crossing the borders every day for work or other matters. To leave the Union would install a more strict border between the two countries, and given that everyone alive has been alive during a union, to some this would serve to essentially make foreigners out of friends, and to some would be bad, as it creates distinction and separation between two countries that to some people are very close. Some people also believe Scotland wouldn't be able to survive by itself. Some claim that the Scottish couldn't survive economically without England's support. The commonly claimed North Sea oil revenues to some are not as lucrative as, for example, the SNP would claim. Critics also point to constant falls in oil prices, detrimental effects on other countries reliant on oil, and a global shift towards renewable resources, as to why Scotland cannot rely so heavily simply on oil. And some people also claim that Scotland needs support from England in order to continue to fund its various policies. With a generous welfare system and free university tuition, Scotland receives more than it gives in relation to the Westminster government, and as such to some, they believe that if Scotland were to become independent, they would have to undergo budget cuts in some areas. Some also believe on this idea of the Conservatives that being part of the Union is beneficial as it reduces the Conservatives' hold over Britain in terms of Parliament. Scotland has 59 seats in Westminster, which, although being a small number, is still quite large, and given that again the Tories almost never win, having these 59 seats serves as a counter to Conservative power, given that they are generally the most powerful party in the country. To some, the Scottish seats are needed to act as a counter, and by leaving the United Kingdom, they would therefore serve to boost the Tories' power in Parliament. Some people also believe that Scotland would have a better global position being part of the Union. The UK holds an extremely important position in many important institutions. So, for example, it's part of the United Nations Security Council permanent members, the 5 of them. It's part of the G20, the G8, and is involved in almost all major global decision-making processes. And as such, to some, it is better to be in the UK, as they therefore have a more independent say in global affairs. The UK is only made up of 4 countries, and as such Scotland's needs will have more weight than, say, the EU, with more than 20 members. And as such, there is essentially more power and better prospects to be held to some, regarding their global position, to remain part of the Union. Moving on, some people believe that devolution has gone far enough, that given Scotland's relative weak positioning in relation to England, that England being the dominant player doesn't really pose a problem, and that devolution gives Scotland concerns over the main issues it wants. They also believe that a federal system of sort may develop in the future, and that devolution in itself isn't a bad thing, that independence, given the costs involved, would not be worth having this slightly higher, to be honest, degree of independence and autonomy. And finally, some people argue that despite what Scottish nationalists may claim, the Scottish and English peoples possess relatively similar political and cultural views. Again, they are so closely related to each other, they are so aligned in so many issues, that to some they are far more alike than they are different. Moving on now to the comparison. On the question of identity, those supporting independence believe in a Scottish national identity. They have been independent longer than part of a union, and some people wish for those times again. They feel different to England and don't feel like they are British, but rather Scottish. However, those opposing this believe in British identity. Britain and Scotland are similar, speak the same language, have a shared past, and as such an identity can be formed from being part of Britain. At the Olympic Games, it's GB, not England and Scotland, that represent each other, and as such, to some again, there is more of a British identity. On the question of the economy, those supporting independence believe Scotland has the means to survive by itself. It has the resources that, once it's able to fully exploit, will fund its economy. And by being independent, Scotland would be able to make decisions that directly are beneficial to Scotland, not, for example, incorporating the English economy into it. Those opposing this view, however, believe firstly that Scotland will not be able to afford its current system alone. North Sea oil is not as lucrative as some believe, and given the amount of money that the English government, or the English economy rather, gives to Scotland, Scotland wouldn't be able to survive in its current state alone. On the question of the Tories, well, those supporting independence believe that the Conservatives have too much control over Scotland via Westminster. Independence is needed to prevent this. Given that Scotland is more left-wing than England is, having a more right-wing party having such a high degree of control is not favourable to some. Those opposing this view, however, believe that Scottish MPs could stop the Tories from dominating the British Isles. They argue that having 59 seats in Parliament means that the Tories will not have a larger degree of control, given that they will likely never win a large proportion of those 59 seats. And also, on a different side to this, 1/5 of Scottish voters did vote for the Conservatives in 2016 in the Scottish parliamentary elections, and as such to say that Scotland is totally averse to conservatism is to some wrong. On the question of what's best for Scotland's global position, well, those supporting independence believe that Scotland can join the EU, which is more important than the UK, and can make its own global decisions. It can act unilaterally and decide where Scotland wants to be globally, not where England wants to be. However, those on the other side believe that being part of the UK gives Scotland more global influence. Leaving the UK would mean that Scotland wouldn't have access to some of the world's most important institutions, given the fact that by itself it's not a very impactful or powerful country in really any means, and as such to some, being part of the UK is better for its global position. On the question of political issues, well, those in favour of independence believe that Scotland should have the right to self-determination. The EU votes show how England still overpowers the Scottish people's will on many issues, and as such independence is needed in order for the Scottish people to decide how they want to live their lives. Those opposing this, however, have a belief in the Union as a political tool. Scotland has devolution and MPs. It has a combined system whereby it's able to reap the benefits of union while still having a high degree of autonomy, just as, for example, the coronavirus response has been proven to show. Scotland has reacted very differently to England, and this shows that on many key issues devolution does in fact work, at least to some. There are also those who argue that England is dominant in the Union, and therefore should have the dominant say. Parliamentary seats are organised by population, and as such the large disparity between English and Scottish seats simply reflects the disparity between the populations and economic powers of the two nations. On the question of devolution, those supporting independence argue that either devolution doesn't solve the issue, or that it doesn't go far enough and will never go further. They believe a federal system, whereby Scotland is an independent state, part of a larger union of states, for example the United States, will never happen, and as such, Scotland needs to be independent to actually have autonomy, and devolution is merely a political distraction from this. Those on the other side, however, believe that devolution provides lots of benefits. It allows a high degree of self-determination while still providing the benefits of being part of a union. They may believe in a federal system in the future, but more so are focused on the benefits of union and the benefits of devolution combining together, and believe the costs to leaving the union would outweigh the benefits of a bit more self-determination. And finally, on the question of, is England and Scotland, or rather Scotland and the rest of Britain, similar or different? Well, to those supporting independence, Scotland and England are different politically and culturally. Although they may speak the same language, they do not have a same shared identity. They have different political leanings, and as such Scottish independence is needed because they are incompatible in a union with a country with which they are different to. However, those on the other side believe that nationalists often overstate the differences between England and Scotland in particular, and that on the whole, they are relatively similar, and as such union again is beneficial rather than detrimental to Scottish interests. Overall then, those in favour of Scottish independence believe that Scotland would be better off as an independent nation and feel inherently different to English. They are tired of being in second place to Britain in the Union and prefer their own ability to self-determination. Those opposing independence, however, feel more strongly towards the British Isles and the idea of being British, and question whether Scotland could survive as an independent nation. Ultimately, they believe that the costs of leaving the Union would be greater than any gained self-determination. The outcome of the Scottish parliamentary elections in 2021 will be extremely important in directing the future of the independence movement. If the Scottish Nationalist Party wins a large majority, then calls for independence will only increase. If they don't gain as many seats, then perhaps calls may subside for a small while. Ultimately though, we will have to wait and see what happens. I will now put the question to you. What do you think on this issue? Do you believe Scotland would be better or worse off with independence? And do you believe that they should have another referendum? And on my point of view, is there anything that I missed, got wrong or could do better? Let me know in the comments or on Twitter, and be sure to check back on Monday for another episode. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all soon.